Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing.
Okay, ready?
Welcome.
to
Eat, Move, Think,
The show about
Optimal
wellness.
brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Probably this is the first episode we've ever had that includes a snippet from the Kardashians.
Definitely since I've been a part of the team. I know everyone's been
This is
waiting.
a huge milestone.
Like we've had so many requests about Kardashian wellness.
Also Hailey Bieber, I think. Hailey Bieber's voice
Let's
is
not
in
forget
this one.
about her. Yes, she is. Kendall Jenner in particular and Hailey Bieber in the latest season of the Kardashians did this weird health thing together.
Wellness thing.
It was their idea of like a hangout, but they seem to think that this therapy that they do will help them avoid aging.
NAD plus drips, NAD plus IV drips. That's what they did. And we're using that as an opportunity to explore an entire category of therapies. We're at this weird moment, aren't we, in human existence where stuff that sounded like science fiction is about to become reality. And that's led us to a point where there are people who are trying to exploit this moment by peddling therapies that are not evidence-based to an unsuspecting public. And so today,
our wellness host and Medcan's chief medical officer, Dr. Peter Nord, is here with Dr. Eric Verdin, and together they're going to separate the science from the snake oil.
I'm Chris.
I'm Jazz. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think.
And today's guest is Dr. Eric Verdin. He's the president and chief executive officer of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging in Marin County, California. A native of Belgium, Dr. Verdin is also a professor of medicine at University of California, San Francisco.
He studies the aging process and its associated diseases. Dr. Verdin served on the scientific advisory boards of Calico, the biotech company that is a subsidiary of Alphabet, the Google umbrella corporation. And his latest thing is a biotech startup called Lifespan, which he'll also talk about in this episode.
It's a fascinating conversation between Dr. Nord and Dr. Verdin about where things are going in terms of longevity. And they'll be talking about things that sound science fiction, but maybe one day soon will not be. If you want to learn about the future of longevity, then this is the episode for you.
Absolutely. Let's get right into it. Here's Dr. Peter Nord.
Dr. Verdin. Thank you for coming to Eat, Move, Think. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Delighted to be here.
Excellent. Well, let's just jump right in. Let's start by talking about one of the buzzier wellness therapies these days, and really thanks to its mention in the most recent season of the Kardashians.
We are on our way to see some friends, and we're just gonna get some nice IV bags. It's what we consider a really fun day.
Do you think that doing like NAD multiple days in a row is fine?
I feel like we're just, really big on our health journey for sure.
I'm gonna NAD for the rest of my life and I'm never gonna age.
They were doing this thing called an NAD plus IV drip therapy. So NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, which is why it's a lot easier to say NAD. First of all, can you tell us basically what NAD does in our bodies, and then what the heck these therapies are all about, and whether there's any scientific evidence to back up the efficacy of the NAD plus IV drip? So over to you.
NAD is a critical metabolite which is present in our cells, in every cell of your body, and not only in us, in every living form. It is the most efficient energy converter. Think about it as and this is where the plus comes from. It exists in two forms, NAD plus and NADH. And think about it, the NADH is the charged form that has energy. The NAD plus is the one without energy. And so by shuttling basically energy from the two forms of NAD, you can transfer energy from one place in the cell to another place in the cell. That's one of the major functions of NAD. Is really, when I make an analogy, think about the Brinks, the company that transports funds in the economy. They are essentially doing the same role. They take the money from the supermarket, bring it to the bank brings it to other stores and so on. So imagine also what happens if Brinks disappears or another like company the economy grinds to a halt. And so it goes with NAD. So that's probably its major function, is really energy transfer within the cell. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is will become clear later. There's another function of NAD, which is what we call a cofactor. It is an important molecule for a number of enzymes that are playing key roles in our cells. And these enzymes are so-called sirtuins and PARPs, poly-ADP ribose polymerase. It's a little complicated, but what your audience should know is that they are both involved in the aging process and both have a protective activity, so that if NAD levels were to decrease, as they do during aging, you see two different effects. One is a decrease in global metabolism efficiency. The whole economy grinds to a halt. And second, these key anti-aging enzymes, sirtuins and PARPs, actually function less well. So that's the background of what NAD does. The reason we and so many are interested in this is there's growing evidence that NAD levels decrease during aging. And so this has generated a whole series of studies trying to understand why does it decrease. And I think we're getting a pretty good understanding of this, and we can expand on this later. And the second one is trying to devise therapies that would actually restore NAD levels. And this is where the idea of providing NAD comes from. Now, there are multiple ways in which the field is focused on to try to restore NAD levels. Your audience might have heard about NR, nicotinamide riboside, or NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotides. These are two molecules that are precursors to NAD, and when administered to an aging animal, tend to restore the NAD levels to what they would be in a younger individual. The preclinical evidence, that is evidence in animal models, suggests that restoring NAD levels can have a very strong protective effect against aging. Now, on top of this came recently the whole idea of intravenous NAD, which, frankly, I didn't see coming, and neither did anybody else in the field, because it doesn't make any sense biologically or chemically. And one reason is the two precursors I mentioned, NMN and NR, are actually basically absorbed by the intestinal tract. They're taking the supplement, and we know they do raise NAD levels. The problem with NAD, as I mentioned, it's an intracellular molecule. It's not present in your blood. And if you inject it into the blood, as these NAD infusion drips are doing, first, I can guarantee you it's not getting into the cell as NAD. It's too big, it's too charged. It just doesn't, there's no known transporter for NAD to go from the plasma or from the blood into your cells. So on the other hand, I mean, a number of people have reported somewhat beneficial effects. So this is purely anecdotal evidence. And before this podcast, I checked one more time to see if there was some magical study that had appeared demonstrating the effect of intravenous NAD, and there's none. There's no literature. No one has studied this really in humans, either for safety or for efficacy. And I think this is where I have the two biggest concerns. So at this point, I would say the field of NAD is full of promise. I should say that the supplement NR and NMN that one can buy today have not been demonstrated to be efficacious in humans. As I said, there's a lot of preclinical evidence in animals, but not in humans. But many of these clinical studies are ongoing. And then there's on the side these clinics selling an IV drip of NAD, which frankly befuddles me.
Clearly not the scientific rigor that we'd be looking for anybody doing research in this area. So that's, So I think we can pretty much put that in the snake oil category rather than the science category. But there is some sort of a link, as you've suggested, between NAD and longevity. And I think you talked about that in a recent paper, got published in Nature. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
So one of the papers that we published recently from my lab identified one of the key molecules that leads to NAD degradation during aging. So I mentioned earlier that we know that during aging in many tissues and in multiple organisms in which it has been studied, we find NAD levels progressively decreasing. And the question has always been, why is that? And what we found is one of the enzymes that actually utilizes NAD, called CD38, appears to be increasing during aging. I should say also, we're not the only one who have found this. My colleague, Eduardo Cini, who is at the Mayo Clinic, has same type of line of evidence. CD38 increases during aging in multiple cells, and this appears to be degrading NAD. So if you think about NAD as a pool, we actually have a leak at the bottom. Now, what most of the field is doing right now is trying to fill up the leak, fill up the tank by putting more precursors, NR and NMN. And what the identification of the source of the leak brings to the front is the possibility of blocking that enzyme, CD38. And again, Eduardo Cini and his colleagues have recently published a paper showing that if you do this, you treat mice with a CD38 inhibitor, they actually live longer, which is pretty remarkable. And we have all kinds of other evidence that blocking CD38 might have some beneficial effect during the aging process as well. So I think it's going to be an area which I think is much more promising than just filling up the leaky tank. You actually go to the bottom and you try to fix the leak itself.
That's great. It sort of makes intuitive sense, and then you're just maintaining your pool of NAD rather than having to think about ways to artificially add to that pool.
Exactly.
Wow. So is that really why the NAD levels decrease with age? It really is the CD38? Is that sort of a one-to-one relationship?
The evidence that was actually published and we by Eduardo Cini first, and that we have verified, is that if you study a mouse that is lacking CD38, you can actually restore NAD levels in most aging tissues. And the same thing with the small molecule inhibitor. If you treat mice with this inhibitor, we also find that we are able to maintain NAD levels throughout aging. The evidence is pretty strong. It doesn't mean that it is the only mechanism. I talked about earlier about the enzyme PARP, poly-ADP ribose polymerase, which is involved in DNA repair. And there's some cases where there might be a lot of DNA damage or chronic DNA damage, where, especially in patients who cannot repair, those patients tend to have a chronically activated PARP, and they show also accelerated aging and a depletion of NAD levels.
Yeah, interesting. And so that's with mice. Are we then thinking about doing human studies in the sort of the same vein?
Yes, and that's the key to this. As you know, many discoveries are made in mice and then find it difficult to actually be translated into humans. But we are determined to bring this technology to humans. And with all the questions that this entails, we don't know, if it's going to work. Full disclosure, I have a startup called Napa Therapeutics, which is developing CD38 inhibitors and is going to be targeting exactly that intervention. But it's still very early days. It's a small startup, and we're in the process of looking for those magical inhibitors.
Yeah, a couple of years away then.
Yes.
So maybe we can take it to the next step then, and you can talk a little bit about the new company and what it's doing now.
So the company Lifespan, actually we just started the first patient, and obviously it's going to take a while to have the results. And the idea is to really take a population large enough that you can really demonstrate efficacy using, cutting edge markers of aging. We really demonstrate that this intervention has what looks like a beneficial effect. Now, one thing I should say is that no one is, able at this point to do lifespan studies. Even though the company is called Lifespan, it will not be measuring lifespan or disease as a readout, because it's just too long and too expensive proposition, especially for a startup. But I think, the thinking is that if we were to identify a large number enough of markers that we know covariate with aging, and then we were to find these markers to go in the right direction, this would be an indication that the intervention might be working. So that's the approach. And we'll be enrolling for the next few months and hopefully finding exciting results. First, how many of these interventions do you need, and how often. Once you've had it, let's say we identify a number of markers that actually decreased, how quickly will they come back if you're trying to get rid of them? So there are a lot of questions that are unanswered that will, imagine a situation where you would need to do this once every 2 months versus once every 2 years. So I think these are very different situations, and this is what we're trying to understand.
Well, very exciting, and it's very timely that we're having you on the episode at the exact same time you're starting that. So maybe what we'll have to do is follow up again in maybe a year's time and see, what the data is the preliminary data is looking like, at least.
Absolutely.
So we mentioned at the outset about lifespan versus health span, and I think we're talking about longevity. So many people are interested in the quantity of life, but they're always interested as well in the quality of life. And nobody wants to live to 100 but have no quality of life versus a short quality of life, and even maybe a little more quality there. So when we talk about quantity versus quality of life, lifespan versus health span, what's your view on that? What are your thoughts on that area?
Yeah, this is a great question, one that really occupies us a lot, because if you think about what has happened over the last 150 years, total lifespan has gone from 40 on average in 1850 to 77 to 80 in most of the Western world today in 2022. So that's our lifespan. Now, one of the things that most of your audience will realize is if I were to ask, do you want to live to 120? Most people will say no. And I ask them why. Because we associate this old age with disease. And this is where the concept of health span versus lifespan comes in. So a health span is the healthy years of life. And it turns out that for you and I, expected to live to 80, most of us, by the time we're 65, will carry at least one chronic disease of aging. And so these diseases of aging are heart attack, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, macular degeneration, type 2 diabetes. This is all of the disease that we see around us in our grandparents. And frankly, they degrade the quality of life. So if by the time you're 65, you're afflicted with those, that means doctor's visits and so on. Now, there's an exception to this. It's the centenarians. So centenarians among us are those people who are lucky enough to live to 100. They don't only live longer, but they also show us the way to live longer because they spend a much smaller fraction of their lives afflicted by these diseases, about 5%. So your typical centenarian will live to 95 in great health and have a 5-year sort of terminal part of their lives. So now, if you look from 65 to 95, you have a 30-year delta, which is remarkable. So first, we know we can live to 100. Enough people have done this, and this is one of the most rapidly growing number of people demographically in the population, global population. So we know we can do this. A small fraction are doing this right now, but I have another number that will also interest you, is that when we look at life expectancy, even though in the US it's 77 or in other parts of Europe it might be 80, there's a lot of variation within each country. And I have the good fortune of living in Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco. Our life expectancy here is 87, and not 77. Now, if you go in some of the poorest areas of Chicago, life expectancy might be 67. So you have a huge delta, and all this is driven by outside factors, we call the social determinants of health, or by lifestyle factors. I mean, factors that come from the environment that you choose or do not choose. And I'm incredibly excited about the idea that before we have the drugs that target aging that we are all working on to develop, we should really optimize what we know how to do. And think about an area like Marin County here, where life expectancy is 87. From living here, I can tell you a lot of people have a very healthy lifestyle, but many also don't. And despite this life expectancy is 87, imagine now if everyone was so-called optimized, exercising or moving, eating and sleeping and not being stressed in the proper way. It's not a stretch to think that most of us could live to 95 years old on average. And that is our immediate focus of our work right now, is to really push this increase in health span and lifespan using what we know. I imagine you mentioned you've done a large number of podcasts on lifestyle factors. I can tell you that they are contributing to the tune of 93% to your longevity in both health span and lifespan. Only 7% genetics that you can blame on your parents. The rest is on you. And to me, that's it's an incredibly positive message, because it means everything. I think about it as an investment in my future. Everything that you do for your health eventually will pay a dividend in terms of quality of life in your later years.
Yeah, we've talked about, just commit an hour a day to all these things, and the payoff, the return on that investment is just incredible in so many ways. We talked mental health, especially during the pandemic. It's been a little harder for people to maybe exercise as much, and we've talked a lot about what's the optimal nutrition to really start to create a foundation for longevity. So all these things, as you said, we know these things. These are not question marks. These have been proven with good, rigorous, randomized controlled trials, and we can all do them. It's just a matter of a willingness to get it done.
I agree. But there's also another part, which is that I think is equally important, and that's something that we're working on, is given that everyone knows you should be doing these things, why is such a large fraction of the population not doing them? And I think some of it comes from, is a communication problem. In a way, everyone knows you're supposed to exercise, but people don't realize, for example, that even walking 20 minutes every day will reduce your overall mortality by 30% across all diseases, 20 minutes a day. And it doesn't need to be strenuous walk. Just moving really has amazing benefit. And so, many people will go buy a pedometer and then, try to religiously abide by the 10,000 steps, which is, by the way, not a magical number. 8,000 works almost as well. So I'm struck by the fact that as a physician, I find it always so difficult to actually extract, even from the literature, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to eat? When am I supposed to eat? Am I supposed to fast? And so there are many questions that need to be addressed to focus on these simple interventions, because they have incredible power, frankly. And I think we do work on this as well.
Well, that's terrific. And it resonates with the entire audience. That's the people that are following these podcasts. You're sort of preaching to the choir, but maybe you're also preaching to disciples that can go out and spread the message as well. So thank you for all of that.
My pleasure.
Well, that's great. So let's move on to another therapy, one that's also been explored in pop culture a little bit. And I hadn't seen this particular episode, but on HBO Silicon Valley, there was one particular scene where the startup is doing a pitch, and in the middle of the pitch, one of the investors has a guy sit down beside him and start to do a transfusion between the two.
Richard, everything okay?
I don't know. Is it?
Oh, sorry. Guys, Bryce, guys.
Is Bryce your assistant?
No, of course not. He's my transfusion associate.
Which is?
Are you really not familiar with parabiosis?
Can't say that I am.
Well, the science is actually pretty fascinating. Regular transfusions of the blood of a younger, physically fit donor can significantly retard the aging process. And Bryce is a picture of health. Just look at him.
So we have a couple of these things that they're different, but they're sort of tied together. The plasmapheresis and then the heterochronic parabiosis. So maybe you could give us a little bit of a 101 on, maybe we can just start with the parabiosis and then we'll move to plasmapheresis.
Yeah, that's actually a fascinating story that we are involved in as well. So first, the concept of heterochronic parabiosis, it sounds like a mouthful to say. Let me explain briefly what it corresponds to. So this is actually a pioneer experiment that was done by Irina Conboy, Tom Rando, and Tony Whiskaray. This is the whole group from Stanford that really were some of the earliest people to do this pioneering work. What the idea is that if you take an old mouse and a young mouse and you suture their skins in a way, this is done by creating an incision on the side of the mouse and then ligating the old mouse with the young mouse. After about 2 weeks, their circulatory system becomes one. Even though they have two hearts, it was shown that the blood circulates from one mouse to the other. So now the old mouse is in the contact with the young blood, and the young mouse is in contact with the old blood. And what is observed under these conditions is actually pretty remarkable, because it turns out that the old mouse starts looking younger and the young mouse starts looking older. And so this really led those colleagues I mentioned earlier to the hypothesis that part of the aging process is caused by two theories. One is that maybe there are rejuvenating factors that are present in the young mouse that actually make their way to the old mouse and rejuvenate it. So that was one possibility. And so this led to a whole series of discoveries of novel factors that can be isolated from young blood, and the idea that by re-injecting these individual factors, one can have an anti-aging effect. But there was always another possibility. These experiments have not fully recapitulated the dramatic effect that we're seeing in the old mice. But there was another theory, which is that maybe the heterochronic parabiosis diluted factors that were present in the old mice and therefore decreased their pro-aging effect. So you either had an anti-aging effect coming from the young mouse into the old, or a pro-aging factor leaving the old mouse and being diluted of. Irina Comboy and her lab actually were able to show that if you extract the plasma from mice repeatedly, you actually get many of the same benefits as from heterochronic parabiosis. And from this came the idea that there's a way that you can actually do this in humans. It's called plasmapheresis. And so the concept of plasmapheresis is the idea that you imagine you're lying on a bed with one intravenous line in one arm, taking your blood out. The machine separates the cells, all your lymphocytes, your neutrophils, all your peripheral blood cells, and it reinfuses the cells along with fresh plasma. And so this is exactly what was done in some pilot studies. There are machines that do this, and they do it so it's actually used in medicine for a number of conditions where there's something in the plasma that you want to get rid of. For example, some patients accumulate some immunoglobulin that can cause autoimmunity and so on. And so the Comboys partnered with Dr. Dobrik Kiprov, who's a world specialist of plasmapheresis, and they conducted some pilot experiments in humans and were able to show some pretty dramatic effects in terms of the effect on aging in older individuals. And these results actually have just been published. And it's a pilot experiment, so it's small. It's not sufficient to demonstrate that this is efficacious, but it's enough to have triggered a lot of interest in the investment world. And so this led to the creation of a new company that we're probably going to talk about called Lifespan. I have a small share of this, really trying to take this data and conduct large-scale clinical trial and really prove the efficacy of these interventions.
That's really interesting. I guess we should just pause and just double down on the fact that we would not recommend transfusion between people, because when we transfuse between people, people die. So right off the top, one thing to sew two mice together, it's quite another thing to think about actually transfusing between people, because there's a lot of things that happen when transfusions are between people that aren't fully matched.
Yeah, just to be sure, as you know, transfusions are a wonderful discovery in medicine, and they can be used for helping people who have had massive blood loss or who are undergoing some unique surgeries. But they're certainly not something that one would consider as a broad application. Or plasma transfusion obviously comes with a risk of infection, from organisms that we do not know yet of. And I just have to remind you of the scare of the 1980s when HIV came on the scene and people did not know what it was, and there was clearly evidence of a large number of people being infected via transfusion. So clearly plasma can be carrying all kinds of nefarious things, and it's not being considered at this point as a therapy against aging, at least.
For sure. And so just to go back to double down on your statement, so when we have plasmapheresis and we're replacing the plasma, where does the new plasma come from?
So it's actually essentially re-injecting saline and a proprietary mixture of other compounds that actually are are necessary. And I can't really go into what those are, but it's mostly saline.
But safe. I mean, the takeaway, juxtaposed against the danger of transfusion, the re-injection of plasma is a very, very safe thing that we do all the time.
Exactly. These are mainstream medical products.
Yeah. So since we're talking about the future, maybe you could give us some predictions just generally about longevity. This is all pretty exciting, but judging from the science of longevity as a field, distinct from the different specific techniques that we're talking about, where do you think we'll be in 20 years? I mean, what will the average lifespan be, and how will 80-year-olds in 2040, how will they be living that they're not living like today?
First, I'll just quote Niels Bohr, who is a very famous physicist, who said it's extremely difficult to make prediction, especially about the future. Yeah. I try not to predict the future. I certainly would not have been able to predict the iPhone about 40 years ago when we started having the first pocket calculators. I think no one could imagine that within 40 years we would have what is the equivalent of a supercomputer at the time. I don't know if you remember the Cray supercomputer. Yeah. They were the first one. They took about a room like my office, and now we're all walking around with one of those in our pocket. I don't have to go into everything that the iPhone is doing, but it's just nothing short of miraculous. And this was accomplished in 40 years, and I think almost no one could really see it. And so this brings me to a little bit of humility in terms of trying to predict what the science of aging will do. One thing I can tell you is parallel to what has happened in terms of the electronic revolution. The century is the century of biology. Last century was the century of physics. The basic underpinning that led to the supercomputer in your pocket were discovered in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And I believe we are in a similar phase right now. The biology, the science of aging are accelerating. We understand more and more. Our tools are becoming more and more powerful. Artificial intelligence is also coming into biology. And we are doing remarkable things in animal models. We can now, routinely increase lifespan in many animal models by 30 to 40% with drugs. And we can double it or triple it or quadruple it using genetic interventions. So all of this gives me incredible hope that the future is bright. The future is bright in terms of aging research and us being able to do amazing things in the future. That being said, there's one thing that we should always consider when we're dealing with medicine is what I was taught coming out of medical school, which is first do no harm. And, we're talking about interventions that we're going to give to people with the hope that their lifespan will increase, that they will survive longer. But there's always a potential to do harm. And many drugs have side effects and consequences that we might not measure. So I'm considered one of the sort of more conservative people in the field because I try to abstain from grand statements in terms of what we're going to be doing. And I think your audience should know that the future is bright, but we're not going to live to 1,000 years old. I personally don't believe that we're going to live to 150 anytime soon. You're asking me what will happen in the next 20 years. I can predict that we will have the first drug that target the aging process in the clinic. I think there are enough companies right now pursuing different directions that we can reasonably expect that one of those will be in the clinic. And so what am I supposed to do now until some of these drugs come on? I think, we know lifestyle factors have a very strong effect on life expectancy. And I think I would encourage your audience to really look at their lives right now and just make sure that they optimize everything that can be optimized because the biology and research is coming with novel solutions, but they're not quite there yet.
That's a great segue because our podcast, we're well over 130 episodes, and I got to think that at least 100 of them have been focused on exactly what you just said about what can we do to ourselves take ownership of, whether it's looking at lipids or looking at glucose and the effect of glucose on our body, looking at exercise, genetics, all those sort of things that come together that we can do today while we wait for something to come in the future, potentially a drug or a new therapy. And as you said, safety before efficacy every time. And so we'll just be continually watching for what's out there, and we will definitely stay in contact with you. Look forward to seeing what kind of advances even in the next 12 months are going to be happening. that'll be the again the foundation for a launching pad for some interesting things to happen in the future.
I would love to stay in touch. I think the field is moving so quickly. I can promise you there will be more to say in about a year.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Dr. Verdin. Really appreciate the conversation and the opportunity to discuss one of our favorite topics here at Medcan, promotion of human longevity and wellness. So thanks very much. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
That was Dr. Peter Nord, Medcan's Chief Medical Officer, in conversation with Dr. Eric Verdin, the Medical Director of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging.
Follow Dr. Verdin on Twitter at Eric Verdin, ERICVERDIN. Follow the Buck Institute at Buck Institute. And last but not least, follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at Medcan Live Well.
We'll post episode highlights and links that you can visit on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. I'm Jasmine Raj, managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantel Gertin, Andrew Imex, and Emily Bozick.
I'm executive producer Christopher Shulgin, and we'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.